Hello, fellow humans, and welcome back to Beyond Words. I'm super excited to be joined by Dr. Joan Bybee, Distinguished Professor Emerita of Linguistics at the University of New Mexico and one of the most influential figures in modern linguistics. In this conversation, we explore how language is shaped by frequency, motor patterns, and context, why sounds and constructions change over time, and what this means for child language development, speech therapy, music, and communication more broadly. We talk about exemplar models, sound change as physical erosion, the myth of purely abstract linguistic units, and why performance and social interaction matter far more than we often assume. So, what lies beyond the words we speak? Tune in and find out. All right. Hey, everyone. Welcome to Beyond Words, conversations on language, music, and mind in collaboration with speechtherapypd.com. I'm your host, Garrett Oyama. I'm a musician, a practicing SLP, and a PhD student with an interest in all things language, music, and cognition. I'm so excited that we have the one and only Dr. Joan Bybee blessing us with her presence today. And here's just a little bit about her. Dr. Bybee is a distinguished professor emerita of linguistics at the University of New Mexico. Her pioneering research on usage-based grammar and phonology has reshaped how linguists understand language structure, acquisition, and change. Dr. Bybee's work, spanning topics from grammaticalization to frequency effects, demonstrates that linguistic patterns emerge through repeated social use rather than innate rules. She's the author of Phonology and Language Use and the Evolution of Grammar, and a leading voice in cognitive and functional linguistics. Before we get started, just a couple of items to mention. Most of these upcoming podcasts, including today's, will include an accompanying course on speech therapy PD that is available for 0.1 ASHA CEUs. And just some disclosures, we each receive compensation from Speech Therapy PD for this podcast, but there are no other non-financial disclosures to report. So without further ado, Joan, welcome to Beyond Words. How are you doing?
Oh, thank you, Garrett. I'm fine, thanks.
I always ask the guests a little bit about their origin story. I'm really interested in how people get interested in language in the first place. So I was wondering what got you interested in this field.
Well, when I was in high school, I took both Spanish and French, and I went to the University of Texas in Austin, and I was, 18. I didn't know what I was doing. My father said, "Why don't you major in languages? You're good at languages, and why don't you get a teaching certificate too, in case anything happens to the husband you're going to get while you're in college?" It's
That's
very
so interesting.
important to him, right?
Yeah.
And so at the University of Texas, which of course has always been an excellent university, there were applied linguistics courses for English majors. I was doing a double major in English and Spanish, so I had applied linguistics for both of those languages, and it was fantastic. They were great teachers, and I just felt like my interest in language just really blossomed. It being able to approach it that way rather than through literature.
Mm,
Literature is fine, but it didn't light my fire, so to speak, that the way that linguistics did.
yeah. So cool. Yeah. I found out, learning second languages throughout life, it has really changed. I think there's so many things that are kind of subconscious about language when when you just speak one language. But as you learn another one, you realize that there's so many things that kind of don't fit into the boxes that you think that they do. And that
Right.
was really eye-opening for me.
Yeah.
I wanted to talk too about something else that we have as a point of common ground, which is I'm a former musician and a music teacher. And I know that you know a bit about music as well. And one thing that just seems so crazy to me about speech therapy when I started was this sort of disconnect between speech and practice. There's like this idea that, most people, parents especially, but they just sort of assume that it's supposed to, it's just like grow like hair or something like that. And then also even SLPs, it was like they sort of assumed that it was just a matter of you teach the way to make this sound, and then that should just
There it goes.
generalize to all the sounds. But,
Yeah.
they forget that, speech is at the end, it's a motor skill, right? So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, I think that's a very important observation. It's a highly practiced motor skill, right?
Yeah.
This is a point that Melissa Redford makes in her interesting paper about language acquisition. Um, and so I do when I play the piano, I play classical music. I've been studying my whole life. I give little recitals once in a while, and I just love it. It's just something, it's a part of my day. I have to do it. But I think about it a lot, and I think about the automatization that it takes to play the piano, to play a musical instrument, and then the automatization that it takes to produce language. But to get closer to your point, one interesting thing is that yes, you could know how to articulate the sound, but if you can't put it into the words where it belongs, then you're not doing it yet. And I
Yeah.
had this experience because I taught phonetics a lot, and I would teach the students about the click languages.
Mm.
And yes, I can make a click. I can make four or five of them, and so on. But if I have to put it into a Zulu word, oh man, I can't, it turns out all wrong, you
Oh,
know,
yeah. Yeah.
because I can't control the nasalization. That's one of the problems. But anyway, so the point is I can make a click, but I can't, it would be a whole different step to get it into the word of a language. And so if you just approach, sort of correcting somebody's pronunciation without embedding it in the words that they're using in a social context. I mean, all of this context is so important. You
Right.
can't, I mean, there's no isolated sound.
Yeah.
There is the lexical and then the social context. So one of the points of the work that I've kind of done throughout my career is to gradually realize how much more context we need. I
Yeah.
was taught, I went to graduate school right after this Chomskyan revolution, but everything was just about this so-called abstract structure somewhere,
Mm. Hmm.
and the difference between competence and performance. And we weren't interested in performance. We were just interested in competence. And so my whole career has been now, oh, wait a minute. What about this part of performance? What about this? You know, what about frequency effects? What about the social context? What about the words?
Yeah.
And it continues. I'm now thinking more and more about social cognition. And so
Yeah.
it's been a long journey. Yeah.
Well, you've done so much for the field. It's really incredible. This and you mentioned social, like kind of the social element, which I find is, is as a therapist, sort of realize more and more how, and I think you make this point with regards to schemas,
Mm.
which you define as motor patterns that are associated with particular goals. And just like with that, abstract concept of making a sound and then, trying to use that as like some aspect of mastery where like, okay, now they could do the sound. If it's not tied to these fundamentally social goals, then it's not that meaningful and it doesn't generalize. And so, in speech therapy, this might be something like functional communication. So it makes more sense to me, and I've seen way more improvement with our kiddos when we can tie this. Maybe they're practicing the K sound or something, but instead of just, drilling the K, you have a carrier phrase like, can I see more? Or, can I
Yeah.
do this? And like
Yeah.
tying it to that social
Very good.
context.
Very good. Yeah. So most recently, I've been thinking about um, activity types. So I did a little paper with a friend about the way people use grab these days
Hmm.
instead of get. And this had been described before by Adele Goldberg, how it goes into the ditransitive construction. So the waitress can say, can I grab you anything else from the kitchen? And and it's fine to say, okay, it's in the ditransitive construction, but how did it get there?
Yeah.
And when you look at data from corpora, and one that works kind of well for me is the soap opera corpus because it's all conversation.
Mm,
Well, it turns out that it goes in that ditransitive construction only when it's first and second person. You never do it for third person. And it's when it's exactly in these kinds of activities where I need you to do something for me or you're offering to do something for me. And so so that use of grab instead of get or take or what or give even let's see, yeah, get or take, that use is tied to some particular activities at first anyway. In terms of language change, it's going to spread out more, but it's not so much that this abstract syntax now has changed as the way people use language in this activity type.
Yeah,
And that you could do with kids so easily, just as you're saying, you know, um, they're common kinds of interactions and practice in that context. Maybe that would,
totally.
yeah.
Yeah, there's a really funny example that you had that was I think it was in the paper on language as a complex adaptive system, but it was something you're making this similar point that we have these usage patterns that reflect some way of thinking, but it's not as if we have a rule book and then, or we have, a dictionary and then a rule book, and then we take these words and then whatever rules we can apply them in any way, and then we get language because so many of, correct grammatical formulations, you would never say. Like, I think it was like, will you marry me versus like, I desire for you to be wedded to me or something like that.
Yeah,
It's like
yeah,
pretty obvious that we have these, experience matters and the conventions of a culture also
yeah,
matter.
right.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. And the ways of saying things, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. And, this is dovetailing really nicely too with some of the neuroscience evidence too, because, recent papers by like Ed Fedorenko,
Mhm.
who's on the podcast, they show that
Yeah.
there's no place in the brain that just does semantics and just does syntax. They're always together. And
Mhm.
that really makes sense with this like usage-based view.
Yeah.
So I think that's really
Good.
cool.
Yeah.
I wanted to talk a little bit about you mentioned this word, the constructicon. I think it's related. Can you talk about what that is?
Okay, well, that's not my word, but it's a common area of research now where before people would write grammars and give you grammatical rules, but the idea now is that of course the grammatical rules are so tied up with the lexicon that you can't really separate them. So people are trying to construct, like kind of like an encyclopedia of the language that connects up the constructions to the words.
Mm,
And I know people have been working on that for Russian and German and probably English too. Um, that's about all I know about it, but I think it's a very interesting concept. I mean, it's that concept that the lexicon and the grammar are not separate, but
yeah.
also to try to come up with a kind of encyclopedia, it's like a grammar, except that it ties to the lexicon more. Then you can do comparisons across languages
Mm,
in a perhaps a more coherent way.
mm,
But
got
I
it.
haven't done that kind of work myself, so I can't really tell you much more about it.
Got it. Yeah. You make this other really interesting point about memory in that it's not that we store these kind of special abstract units, which I think is still the prevailing view in speech therapy. The way that we are taught is that, you create these kind of strict categories for sound. And you make the point that, we're not actually storing abstract single representation for, I don't know, a velar or plosive or something like that. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Partly because we write with an alphabet. We think in terms of alphabetic segments, English speakers, most Europeans. And I think that biases us towards this idea that once a P, always a P, or once a velar plosive, then always. But it's really possible that what we know and actually store is a whole bunch of words, and they're categorized for similarity, because one of the things we know the brain does all the time is categorize everything. Every input has to be categorized and put somewhere. And so once you do that, then all the words that start with a P or end with a K, they're going to be, connected somewhat. And you know this because you can ask people give me some words that rhyme or name 10 words that start with P. And people
Hmm.
do that very easily. But it doesn't necessarily mean that your P at the beginning of a word and the P after S and the P at the end of the word are pulled together. You can function perfectly well without,
Yeah.
abstracting something that, and we what we don't know, and we have, well, as you know, a lot of this is based on an exemplar model where
Hmm.
we're storing a lot of detail and categorizing and coming up with associations among words. What we don't know is to what extent we do actually abstract. And that's at every level. That's semantic, syntactic, morphological. We just don't know because given our memory capacity, we could get along without pulling out, the one abstract thing. And, maybe you do like, say, noun phrase or uh, e- I think actually noun phrase is a pretty good example where you might have some kind of abstraction because noun phrases are very similar and they behave the same way and they can be subjects or objects of preposition. So maybe there's something there. But then if you go to something like verb phrase, well, then you have such a huge, you know, uh, variety of things that could be there. I think, no, it's it's a verb and all the things that go with it. But we
Yeah.
don't know. We don't
Hmm.
know. To me, it's one of the most fascinating questions is I do believe we store a lot of detail. I don't know how much we actually form abstractions.
Mm. Yeah. It sort of reminds me of the machine learning literature now in a way, in that
Yeah,
you feed the machine a bunch
this,
of different
right.
exemplars, and then they sort of group things by similarity. But there's no like one special perfect member of that category. It's just that they have,
Right.
yeah,
Yeah, right. And they're fairly successful in doing that. Although there may be some differences between the way the generative AI does that and people do, but I don't know if
yeah,
what they are yet.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
definitely.
yeah. But indeed, I mean, little children, all of us, we're just taking in stuff all the time, right? Visual, audio, everything. So
Yeah.
it's kind of
It,
amazing.
yeah, I was having this thought recently that it's hard to separate learning from experience, because almost all of
Mhm.
experience is learning
Mm,
to some degree, and
mhm.
maybe some affect structure more deeply in the brain. But yeah, and especially for little kids that are, their brains are so plastic. Like learning and experience are, they're always learning.
Right.
they're
It's
they're
all
picking up
new.
patterns.
Yeah. And it's
Yeah.
all new to them.
Have you heard of this concept of Gestalt language processing in speech therapy? It's become a very popular term. And I've had these questions about it because to me, based on this framework, and especially given the fact that as a kid, you learn language not by like learning individual letters and then building up the word. You hear a
Right.
phrase or a word, you
You
hear
hear
like,
chunks.
do you wanna, or,
Yeah.
see you later. And that is like kind of the representation in your head. And Gestalt language processing kind of makes these two categories. They say that, and this comes from a lot of the autism literature. And so they say that a lot of kids, they categorize them as Gestalt processors, meaning that they learn big chunks,
Uh-huh.
like scripts, and
Uh-huh.
then they break them down into parts. And so we see this maybe in autistic kids where they're learning the scripts of a Disney movie that they love, and then they're
Mm.
using that. And then they have another group of analytic processors, which are supposed to learn by acquiring these small phonological or grammatical units and then build larger structures. But to me, that seems like everyone learns in a Gestalt way, in a way.
Yeah. The word I would used for that was holistic versus analytic. But we all do both.
Hmm.
And well, even quite some time ago, there was a book by Ann Peters about children that learned bigger chunks that were what you'd call the Gestalt learners, and then gradually broke them down, as opposed to the kids that go one word at a time, and have a
Hmm.
one word stage and then a two-word stage, right?
Right.
So this has been around, and I think you're right that it goes both that everybody has to do both, right? Because you do have to know what the larger chunks are, or you're not going to learn about the dependencies. But you can analyze. And so I wrote a little paper about this because I'm interested in it from the point of view of language change.
Hmm.
And it was about, let's see. Oh, there was this expression, he didn't even have two sticks to rub together. You're so poor, you don't have two sticks to rub together, or you don't have two nickels to rub together, or two pennies. And that I could trace that in a corpora where that became um, more common, but people made substitutions. It could be, I thought maybe the origin was rubbing two sticks together, like to make a fire. But then it, could be two nickels or two pennies. And then it began, once it got kind of fixed, then it began to move. And you find people saying he didn't even have two brain cells to rub together,
I
which I
like that
think is
one. I'm going to use
really
that.
funny. Yeah. So it begins to take on metaphors, but so it became, it got a meaning. Um, but then you could still analyze it. So you could still change nickels to brain cells.
Mhm.
And so that shows that you're doing both things. You're doing the analytic and the holistic processing all throughout the history of this little expression.
Yeah, that's so cool.
I thought it was fun. Yeah.
I love that you've also extended the idea of language change to even to sound change.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, can you talk
A
about a little bit about this? I thought it was fascinating.
sound change?
Yeah,
Oh, I've always been really interested in sound change. I mean, that's the heart of classical historical linguistics is to do sound change, right?
right.
Because every everybody has so many uses. But anyway, you want to know what I think about sound change, or
I loved some of the examples that you give because I think it's cool
tell
to.
tell me an example. Do you remember
So
any?
there was one on reductions. This was a Spanish one. So like lado and grado. So
Yeah,
the was the intravocalic D is
yeah,
reduced because it's a high frequency word. So
right.
there are some of these pressures that actually drive sound change. It's not just sort of like random or um,
Exactly, exactly. So, yeah, so that's of course what interests me. But so there are phonetic pressures, and they're different for different languages. They're similar in the sense that they are usually caused by the automatization, and therefore they create something that appears to be maybe more efficiency, like your gestures aren't quite as big as in lado versus lado. The tongue doesn't go quite so high when you do the fricative instead of the stop. And then things about, assimilation, where you get overlapping of gestures. Those are big general trends that you find in all languages. And then you have things going slightly different ways. Like in English, if you're going to reduce a T or a D, you make a flap, which is just temporal. It's just a T. The T in latter is just faster than the T at the beginning. The D in latter is just faster than the D at the beginning of the word. So that's what happens in English. You go faster. In Spanish, you just don't go quite as far.
mm,
And usually these things are very regular. In a phonetic environment, like in Spanish, after a vowel, a D is going to be a fricative, or in English, a T or a G after a stressed vowel is going to be a flap.
mm.
And if you look back at the history of languages, you see it's all very regular. And so then, we go from, oh, it looks really regular to saying it is regular. Well, that's sometimes a mistake we make. So what we've noticed, if we can study sound changes as they're going on, um, that they actually don't affect all words at the same time, which if you just think about it, it would be really hard to suddenly change your pronunciation of all words at the same time,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
because it actually has to happen as people talk and as they use words.
Hmm.
So the more a word is used, then the more frequent it is, the more it undergoes, the more it has a chance to be eroded by going through your articulatory processes.
Yeah. Oh,
And
yeah.
so, yeah,
Oh,
so it's a kind of feedback thing. And if you have an exemplar model, you can model that. If you don't, you can't. If you're
hmm.
just changing phonemes, you can't do it. But so like the representation of lado, which means side in Spanish, it's a very common word, that exemplar cloud changes gradually because you produce it a little more reduced gradually, and other people produce it a little more reduced. And so that exemplar category can change slowly. But the low frequency words don't change as fast. Now,
Yeah.
there might come a point where, eventually everything changes and the low frequency words are affected too. But while it's going on, it's really kind of almost a physical process.
That's
Um,
so fascinating. I mean, just the fact that it like is kind of like physical erosion, like over
yeah,
time.
it is
Yeah. And
exactly.
I
Yeah,
remember you saying at some point that you know, part of it is about prediction because because this
right.
is a dynamic process, right, between two people, if your context, because it's so frequent, this word is so frequent, and you hear it a lot in the same contexts, and it's
Yeah,
highly predictable, you can
yeah,
kind of loosen up the precision of your articulation, and that like
that's right.
drives
Yeah,
it.
yeah. Okay, so that's an interesting point, and this is still debated. Is it
Mhm.
audience driven? That is, if you know that the other person is going to recognize the word, you're allowed to reduce it more. Or it could just be just because you use it more, it just gets worn down.
Mm.
And both things might be right. I don't know. I'm sort of more in the physical erosion kind of camp, but it is clear that we have to always attend to our audience,
Yeah.
right? So, I mean, we're not just speaking to ourselves. So,
Right.
yeah,
Maybe that this is a segue just to get back into some of the speech therapy stuff is that there's so much people neglect this idea that it's a dynamic process between individuals, that's what communication is for. And so, in speech therapy, there's this model of like, you're like looking at the individual, you just take them out and then you flashcard drill them. Um,
yeah,
and I think a lot of the going back to the even just the motor schemas, like a lot of those are taking place like in the home where they need to, you know, say that they need help from their
yeah,
parent
they
or
need
something like
something,
that.
they want something, yeah. Right. And so this is also kind of a newish revelation for me that when people are conversing, they're very much aligned. And there's a lot of conversational analysis literature about that. Actually, some of those famous people have always been at UCLA, but where people finish each other's sentences, or if you study a real conversation, there may be interruptions, but they're always very relevant, or the person adds a word. So it shows how very much aligned, like we become almost one organism as we communicate with each other.
Mm,
Well, there's phonetic alignment too. So when two people with slightly different English vowels are talking, then their vowels begin to converge
mm,
and become more alike.
mhm.
There have been studies of college roommates from different dialect areas, with recording them every few weeks throughout the semester, and their vowels their phonetics converge.
Wow, that's
So,
fascinating.
so um, we are aligning. I mean, I'm picking up on your phonetics, you're picking up on mine,
Ah,
and it's creating these subtle changes. And this, of course, is happening with children. I mean, it must be. I don't know studies specifically with children, but of course it is. And that's why they speak like their parents and they speak like little kids they speak to all the
Yeah.
time. So it's really important to understand it, as you said, as a dynamic between more than one individual.
Yeah, it's so interesting because when I was working in the schools, I had so many kids that would come in and they'd, be diagnosed with this like, syntax disorder. And then you meet the parents and they are, second language English speakers who are
Right.
only speaking English to their kids at home. And, and you could hear in the kids, I guess they're maybe you call it an idiolect, that they have these different ways of phrasing things and slightly different ways of pronouncing things, and it makes sense that this is a result of experience. And I think most people
Right.
don't think about that as they think there's something wrong with the brain or like there's some issue there,
No,
but it's just a matter of experience.
exactly. Yeah. They used to, in New Mexico, send little Navajo kids to speech therapy. There wasn't anything wrong with them.
Yeah,
They just
yeah,
spoke Navajo instead of English.
right,
Yeah.
right.
So we have to be a lot more aware of the home environment and, who the children are talking to. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think this maybe it would be helpful to start thinking about speech therapy in this different way of, based on these ideas, especially usage-based ideas, we should start thinking of the whole family system or, maybe even the whole community.
Or-
Um,
Right. Or even like the, kids' interactions and their activities and yeah, relate it very much to their everyday language use
yeah.
because otherwise it's not going to help them very much.
Yeah. Right now, I mean, still, it's like a lot of the speech therapy is based on things like minimal pairs or these flashcard drills, um, which, right, like you mentioned, are not tied to a schema that they're going to be using.
Right. Yeah, and my friend that I wrote that article with for the Handbook of Clinical Phonology, Anna Sosa, she pointed out to me that children might correct a sound in some words, but not in the high frequency ones.
Yeah.
And that's because those are very embedded and entrenched, the high frequency words, and they're very entrenched in certain situations. So whatever the child learns from you may never get in to to the way he or she is actually using words.
Oh, yeah. I mean, thinking about this from a music teacher perspective too, it makes so much sense because the motor plans, like they're deeply entrenched motor plans, they take a really long time to change. Like I
Oh yeah.
had at some point in my career as a guitar player, I had to change the way I was doing everything. So my finger movements weren't correct. I had a teacher that was like, "Oh no, you're doing this whole thing wrong." And then to relearn like that whole
Oh,
skill, it's
hard.
just, it's so hard and it takes it just takes a long, long time. We've got to maybe recognize that, yeah, because I think, back to that point of you can say the sound in some words, but not others. I think that's a very common, but mysterious thing for therapists. They're like, why is this? He could say the G sound, but he's not saying it in go,
Not doing
Um,
it right.
and this model really makes sense of why that might be the case.
Yes, yeah, exactly.
And it feels like then that just trying to squeeze in, if you have 30-minute, 60 minutes a week or something like that, trying to squeeze in the amount of time to overwrite a motor pattern that's like so deeply entrenched like that, it doesn't seem that plausible. Whereas if you get the whole family on board and you get even the teachers on board or something, that might be more helpful. Because I noticed that with a lot of parents, they tend to, because you have this sort of special way of interacting with your child where you know what they want to say, those patterns, they're just being, kind of perpetuated because it's like, oh, I know that when they say this sound, they really mean this one. So it's never changing.
Hmm. But don't the children eventually, learn even I mean, when you're successful, even the high frequency words get the new sound in them.
Oh yeah, I mean, like over time, most of these things, maybe from the pressures of the community or something like that, they change. But some kids, they're definitely more resistant to change.
Yeah, maybe harder for them. Well,
I
there are all these different learning styles too, right? I mean,
right.
one knows as a parent how different kids are in you know, in how they learn things.
Oh,
Yeah.
definitely. And you also made this point. This is sort of just the extreme of what we were talking about, but with non-speech oral motor exercises, this is just another example of something that's not tied to any context, so may not be helping.
Yes, right. Yeah.
I did have a question as well about music, because this is something that was really, really interesting to me, but there might be some maybe problems with this approach, given that, maybe it requires some amount of transfer or something like that. But we're working on an intervention that used beatboxing. So I don't know if you're familiar with beatboxing, but that's basically making drum sounds with your mouth. So like,
Oh,
things like
oh,
that.
uh-huh,
But a lot of them can be transcribed in IPA, or you make them similar to
uh-huh,
uh, how you create these sounds. And anecdotally, at least, kids really love doing this, and then they are able to kind of generalize some of these new
uh-huh.
sounds that they're making to speech. But I was wondering if you had any thought about whether,
Gee, I don't really know. It sounds like though you're helping the child realize the flexibility of the articulators and maybe work on certain muscles that they hadn't been using before. I mean, it seems like a valuable exercise, but I couldn't predict whether it
yeah.
would help that much. But, if the kid thinks it's fun, then that's a big plus, right?
Oh,
You
yeah.
can, right, because you can maybe use that to get into the part that's less fun.
Yeah. And you could always, I think, weave real language into that. And that's something that's so underrated. Just
Oh,
something that will get a kid's attention and be fun.
can they do like I think mostly older kids do this, but these language games where you substitute. So could they substitute in a word, and you might say to them, uh, for these words, put that in instead of P or something.
Yes, that's kind of how we were doing it.
Is that what you do?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is like adding, after they learn these patterns, and they're creating these, like, some kids, they have trouble making a um like a strong velar plosive or something like that.
Uh-huh.
And this activity, we could say, once they learn this pattern of, like, making a snare drum sound like
Oh yeah.
um we
And
could
then
say, okay, use the snare drum now in your word. Now we're going to use the snare drum
mhm.
um to say cat. And so anecdotally that seemed to help.
Yeah, actually, I did something like that with my son because he was the kind of learner who just wouldn't even try until he thought he had it right.
Mm.
He's always been like that. And he didn't actually talk very much until he was 2. But then he like spent a week in the one word stage and off he went. But he didn't want to say that TR tra, that's so weird in English, but it's in train, track, and truck. And those were his favorite things.
Oh,
And I'd
poor
say,
cat.
what is it? And he would. So I taught him to say cha instead. I said, oh, it's a chain. Just say chain, tractor, chuck. And he did that. And then almost immediately he got the TR.
Hmm. Oh, cool.
Yeah,
I
I'm just a born speech therapist,
Yeah,
Gary.
yeah, I know, you got it. You have it in your blood. I wanted to ask about one thing that I really loved from this complex adaptive systems paper as well, was this idea of the idiolect and the dialect.
Yeah.
And I think that maybe the reason I liked it is that it gives an example of what good language is, because I think that could be a nebulous concept. But based on that, an individual's language is good to the extent that it converges with their, social cultural dialect most perfectly. And so, in a sense, it gives you the most like communicative power. And yeah, I guess maybe for people who don't know, can you talk a little bit about what an idiolect is and why that's
Well, let me
important?
ask you something. You said good language. Usually linguists don't talk prescriptively like this. So
Sure.
what's the context for that? Talking.
Yeah. Well, I guess what I was trying to get at is it's used colloquially a lot as like, oh, this kid has good language and this kid doesn't have good language. But
Really?
in my head, it's like there's, maybe we shouldn't be talking about that. We should be talking about how well are they able to adapt in their particular environment and like communicate things in their particular environment. And maybe for this kid who, for example, the one who was you're speaking at home with his parents who are Spanish speakers, but they're speaking English to him. Maybe that means that, he has a good language in the home. Like he's able to
Right.
get his ideas across in the best way, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And he's absorbed what's in the environment.
Right.
Right. Yeah. So, yeah, the notion of an idiolect is maybe it's tied to this idea of an individual cognition, which I'm beginning to think is a little bit problematic
Hmm.
because nobody has any cognition outside of a community. I mean, we're all learning, and especially with language, my linguistic representations are highly influenced by all of the language around me and what I hear. There's no, specific, yeah, it's true, this is a brain, but I'm absorbing everything from my community. And if you look carefully at the sociolinguistic literature now and what Labov was saying after decades of study, he says the community is prior to the individual
Hmm.
and that yes, there are individual differences, but what succeeds in change and, what the individual does is totally influenced by the community he's a member of or she's
Hmm.
a member of. And so, this idea that there's an individual cognitive grammar that's somehow separate from the rest of the community, it just can't be.
Hmm.
It just isn't,
Hmm.
because our experience is totally built up. Everything in our brains are built up from our interactions, our experience with other people.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's like these interactions almost, tell me if I'm getting this wrong, but it almost feels like they are interactions themselves contain maybe not contain is not the right word, but they are part of this language map artifact. It's being constantly co-constructed and built up with people. It's not just as if
Yes.
like you have a
Something
thing and they
special.
have a thing. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And
Um,
I used to think about it that way, you know, be, I did. Especially in our culture where we think a lot about being individuals instead of being members of the community.
yeah.
So we all have this kind of bias that there's something individual, but I'm beginning now to doubt that more. And when I see the way variation works and the way change works, I see the whole community is changing together. Um,
Yeah.
and yeah, they're individuals. There's a there's variation, there's static, but basically directionality, everybody's moving in the same direction. And that's true of both their phonetics and their grammar. And
Mm,
so I've been thinking more about that lately, about how we don't have individual cognitions because it's totally shaped by all of our experiences in interaction.
mm. Does that change how you think about language development at all?
You mean in children?
Yeah. I mean, it's such a yeah, it's a beautiful idea. It's kind of brain twisting because we're so used to thinking of we give this kid a language score. We like we
Oh,
we
yeah.
we apply this like, okay, here's their language, and they have, they fall right here
Yeah.
on this scale,
Uh-huh.
and we
Uh-huh.
can measure it.
Very good.
Um,
Yeah.
and so, I wonder, with this perspective, what changes in how we um, think or talk about language, or treat it even.
Yeah. That's that's very interesting. I guess I had always thought that children were influenced by their input they're getting, but I see your point because I've never been in your position to like say try to rate this individual child. But the examples you've been giving show that it's not necessarily just the child, it's the environment the child's been in.
Yeah. Yeah,
Uh,
which is, I think that's why I was mentioning I guess I like this idea of having, and I guess maybe this is a wrong conception, but like having the idiolect dialect, and then how well it like maps to their particular environment. Because to me, that seems like a better measure of a child's communicative power and efficacy,
right, exactly.
than some like standard score that they might get, which who knows what that means really. Yeah.
Exactly. So, in the end, most children grow up speaking just like the people around them. This is this is why you can identify dialects, you
Mm.
know, and you can say, oh, you sound like a Californian or you sound like a Texan, or because they do acquire all of that very specific detail.
Mm.
Um, I mean, I'm not sure about the children you work with, but certainly normal children, and even I'm sure a lot that you work with, they end up talking just like everybody else. And when I did have a little time working with child language people because a project that Dan Slobin um, invited me to as the sort of linguist, typologist person.
Mhm.
And the people in this workshop were working on lots of different languages, some of them with very complex morphology. There are, as you know, languages that have case markings on nouns and, 10 different verb classes. And these people were saying to me as a linguist, why do languages need all this and why do children learn it? And when you think about it, you realize that you can communicate without a lot of good phonetic detail. I mean, people do who are non-native speakers. Everybody, I mean, it's okay. Um, you can leave off all the case endings and verb markings, and you can still get your point across. So the question is, why do children learn all these things and the languages keep them, right? And I think it's because, well, children are very good at imitation, and that's in the past have been kind of a dirty word to say, oh, human beings imitate. No, you know, but they do. They're very good at it. But what the child is doing isn't learning a language specifically, but learning to be a human being in a culture
Mm.
and hoping to grow up to be an adult in this culture, but learning to be a human being. So if the people around you are pronouncing their T a certain way, well, that's exactly what the child gets. Or if there's 17 case markers, well, you still got to do it, right? And so that's an idea that has helped me understand how languages maintain their complexity and uh, why little children put up with it, know. But because children learn how to hold their face, they walk like other people in their culture, they learn from their peers and their family all of the things that you need to do to be like a human being in this culture, right?
Mm. Yeah, there are so many. invisible kind of invisible aspects of growing up that
Yes. Yeah.
that are picked up, these that are like these invisible regularities in the environment. It's just pretty amazing that kids are able to do this. It just blows my mind.
Well, but it actually takes a very long time. That's another thing because in the Chomskyan framework, they would say, "Oh, and the child has acquired the syntax by age 4." Well, no, I don't think so. Maybe age 15, you know? I mean,
Yeah,
really, to get a full adult, you know, uh, grasp on morphology, syntax, phonetics, the intonation, the prosody, the conversational conventions. I
yeah,
mean, that's way, way late. I mean, it takes a long time, don't you think?
yeah,
Because,
absolutely.
you
I
know, you
mean,
talk to a 12-year-old and they're still a little weird, you know, and their
yeah.
interactional type or their syntax. And so it's a really big, long process
Well, I feel
to
like
get
I'm still learning it
every
too. Yeah,
Well, right. I mean, you know, when you take a course in a subject, then you're learning how to talk about that subject, right?
yeah,
And so, yeah, you're still doing it, right? So,
yeah.
yeah.
I was talking with Kathy Hirsch-Pasek last week, and she was talking about how there are these, there's this conversational duet that goes on
Mhm.
with the kid. And most of the things that are important in the conversation is like not in the words that we're
May not be explicit.
transcribing. Yeah, they're in the
Yeah,
prosody or the timing in between a response and or a bid and a response,
right.
and they follow actual rules that can be
None,
broken.
yeah, but none of us are aware of them,
Yeah,
right?
and we're not aware of them. Yeah. So this idea that kids even at 12, there are like kind of these invisible aspects of language that are still you know
Developing.
developing.
Yeah,
So cool. And thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate you coming on and speaking with me.
you're very welcome.
I wanted to know just a couple more things. And one is I wanted to know what you're excited about right now and what you think are aspects of language that still need to be studied that we don't know enough about yet.
Well, right now I'm excited. You know, as you know, my main thing is how languages change. So I've been working on certain changes that you can follow through about 200 years of American English, starting with written literature and into the 20th century. And
Cool.
so, and it, so I'm excited about the idea of studying the changes in activity types. So talking about planning, for example. So what I'm looking at is be going to which was very, you know, like it's going to rain, or what are you going to do with the body? That kind of question, you know. Um, and it was that construction's been around a long time. And then in the mid 19th century, it suddenly became very frequent.
Hmm.
And then it started undergoing a lot of change. And what we discovered it became very frequent because people started talking about their plans more. And they started using that instead of will, the other future marker will, like what will you do? But we think there are some cultural changes going on at the same time. And other people have pointed to changes throughout the 19th century uh, of ways of talking about obligation and whether you accept it as a personal obligation or it's some kind of obligation from fate or rules or something. And so I think that it could be very interesting to discover if certain cultural changes show up in certain linguistic changes.
Hmm. Yeah, tying this into a little bit into language development, it, it feels like in some ways you need to understand what ideas are being expressed in order to use the particular language that is associated with those ideas, if that makes sense. Um,
Yeah, yeah, and children also take a long time to learn exactly how to talk about obligations and permission and or maybe even plans because there's a whole lot they're just loaded with social connotations, right?
Yeah, so many.
Yeah,
And like one phrase I realized, and this becomes so apparent when you learn a second language too, is like there's
right.
like one phrase that you start to use it in one way because you're like, oh, it must mean that. But then you realize that it doesn't really fit with all the places it's
No.
used.
And then you don't know what to use instead because you
Yeah,
don't know enough of the language.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah, I noticed that too. And trying to use modals in Dutch, which they have the same ones, but they don't mean the same thing at all.
Mm,
And they don't use them as much as we do in English. And
mm.
I just was stuck. I didn't know how
Yeah,
to say certain things. Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, it's so I guess just one thing to remember is like these kids are faced with the monumental task of disambiguating all these invisible patterns.
Yeah, and understanding the whole social context and who's allowed to boss who around and that sort of thing, right?
Yeah. And
Yeah.
that social understanding is very, very important too, right? Because that helps you, that's the thing that helps you kind of categorize those phrases effectively. Or if you don't
Right.
understand a social intention or, the social context, you're maybe going to be using that thing in the wrong way, which
Yeah.
is actually what I kind of think is going on in Gestalt language processing, where a child is using a script from a movie in this one particular way. It's like,
Oh, uh-huh.
yeah, and they haven't been able to disambiguate phrases in the same way that the typical learners do because they aren't quite getting the social context and the social connotations of each of the times that we use a particular phrase.
Yeah. Do we have time to go back to something briefly? I wanted to say something more about music.
Of course. Oh,
Because
yes. I,
remember we talked about the Gestalt versus analytic processing,
yeah.
or I called it holistic, and how in music you do have chunks of phrases or even smaller. But in order to actually be effective, say, as a performer, you can't just chunk everything because it's too easy for stuff inside the chunk things to go wrong, right? You're
Yeah.
playing fast. I mean, in order to play fast and fluent, you have to chunk. You have to
Hmm.
make it all one sequence, but you can't forget what was inside of it because if you do, you'll make a mistake, right?
Oh, man.
This
Happened to me so many
fascinates
times.
me about music, how you do have to make it a whole thing, and yet you can't um, forget all the analytic parts of it.
Yeah.
Do you ever have that experience?
Oh, yeah, for sure. All the time. My background is more in jazz, but that chunking
Well,
idea is,
but I mean, jazz, you have to have that chunking idea. I mean,
yeah,
that's what you do. You learn a bunch of chunks and then you reposition them and put them in and out. Yeah.
yeah,
But you also have to, yeah, anyway.
yeah.
So, well, that fascinates me, improvisation, because that's actually what we're doing when we talk.
Right. I think jazz is such a great analogy for conversation
Yeah,
because it
yeah.
really, there's so many when you first learn, like when I was a music teacher, I'd try and get my kids to improv, and at the, when you just think about it as a definition, it's like, oh yeah, just make up stuff and you'll be soloing. But you realize that once you let a student do that,
Yeah.
they can't. It's like they don't have all that invisible structure that we were talking about.
All that experience. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And people improvise classical music too.
Oh,
Actually,
really?
I didn't realize that at first, but yeah, especially, the Haydn Mozart kind of thing. There's so many conventions with it that you can just take these conventions and patch them together and you come up with a new, you can improvise. I've seen people do it. It's really cool
That's awesome. Do you
because
have
it's the same thing. Yeah.
what are you working on now? Any piece
Oh
or
yeah,
piece?
Beethoven. It's a Beethoven sonata, the Pathétique, which is just gorgeous. And I now have all three movements, and I'm playing it for my friends once in a while.
That's amazing. I
It's
love
fun.
that. Yeah, I've been listening to a lot more classical music recently. More like Debussy,
Oh, I
on and
loved
off
it.
Ravel, like that kind
Yeah,
of.
I've played a lot of Debussy. I like it a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Oh man, just
And
incredible
and
pieces.
he's like with the beginning of jazz because he's got those chords that didn't occur
Yeah,
before.
those the
Those
extended 13th
long,
chords and
yeah,
stuff. Yeah. Oh
right.
man.
Yeah, yeah. That makes it hard for a classical musician, you see, because you look at that and you say, "Oh, what chord is that?" But
Yeah.
you can hear the jazz in it. Yeah.
Oh yeah. The harmonic color is really what drives like really
Oh, yeah,
makes it pop for me.
yeah.
Yeah.
Cool.
Well, thank you so much, Joan.
Well, that was so much fun, Garrett.
This is
Thank
so
you.
fun. You're an inspiration. Thank you for your work.
Mhm.
If people want to get involved or contact you, is there a place they can find you, or do you prefer not to be
No, I mean, if
contacted?
people have questions, I'm open to getting emails. I'm joan.bybee@gmail.com.
Okay, easy.
And if anybody has questions about what we've talked about here, that's fine with me. And I'm happy to share this if when you send me the link.
Oh, fabulous. Thank
Okay.
you again. And everyone, take care, stay curious, and hope to see you in the next episode. Bye bye.